So what was the Prime Minister like back in the days when he was a fierce advocate for liberty? I'm joined now by Petronella Wyatt, who worked at The Spectator when Boris Johnson was editor and who knows his character well. Petronella, thanks for joining us today. Fraser wonders in his cover piece whether the PM has lost his liberalism. Do you think he has?
Yes, I do. I think the problem with Boris is that not that he doesn't have a series of beliefs, because he does, and they are instinctively liberal, but they're not deeply held enough. They're not so deeply held that they can't be sacrificed to what he sees as political expediency and the continuing prosperity of Boris Johnson. I think, unfortunately, his greatest belief is in himself. So he's not a conviction politician, and he's very much an opinion poll sort of Prime Minister. And he yo-yos all over the place because he thinks this is what is going to please people. And I think that's a terrible weakness in a Prime Minister, because you have to have a consistent policy. You have to have the moral courage to stand up for what you believe in. But I don't think, going back to his beliefs, yes, he has a history of expanding liberal beliefs, but I don't think his beliefs are terribly profound. I don't think he's a terribly profound person.
And yet he's spoken with such a fierce passion and defense of liberty in the past. I mean, he used to rail against things like ID cards, which is now seems like a much lighter policy compared to a vaccine passport. He said in The Telegraph in 2004 that if an official ever was asked to see an ID card, he would take it out of his wallet and physically eat it. You're suggesting, though, that even putting forward those robust defenses of liberalism, the polls now matter more to him.
Yes, but also remember that he put forward these views in articles, and his articles were always very entertaining, and there was always an element of exaggeration. He would not have actually eaten his ID card. I honestly can't see him doing that. Boris is a performer, and performers will exaggerate, and performers are more interested in the performance than in beliefs. Because honestly, if his liberal beliefs were so strongly held, he wouldn't be doing this. He would not be thinking about vaccine passports, which is so coercive. He wouldn't be saying to businesses and offices, well, you don't have to wear a mask, but if you don't, we will force you to. I mean, he's not acting like a liberal conservative. Why isn't he? Because his liberal conservative beliefs aren't that strong, and his desire to stay in power is stronger.
Of course, that mask mandate is lifting, although the PM's talk in recent days has been extremely cautious, and they seem to have done quite a few U-turns, at least in terms of the rhetoric, about how they're going to treat Freedom Day. Petronella, you knew Boris Johnson when he worked at The Spectator. What was he like then?
He was a very genial person, but you would notice that he would say different things to different people, make them different promises, because he's a people pleaser, and that would get him into a lot of trouble. And in the end, you end up pleasing nobody, and this is what he's been like as a politician. He sees opinion polls, which may or may not be accurate, claiming that a significant number of people want to keep going with the restrictions. But some of these polls are dubious, like the Ipsos Mori, because the FT took it apart. And this is why he sort of does this. But it's not a sustainable policy, because it's not leadership. I mean, going back to his personality at The Spectator, he did have a tendency when it came to politics to agree with one person on the right and then 10 minutes later in another room agree with one person on the left. And that's just Boris, because Boris wants to be liked. But it's not a great trait in a leader, especially during a crisis.
Are we getting to the crux of it in the sense that Boris Johnson really supports liberalism in the sense that he likes to be able to do what he wants? But then when it comes to something like a national emergency where the government has, huge amounts of power over our lives, he quite likes to be able to do what he wants. The problem is that we all have to follow along with it too.
Yes, I would say that's a very good summation. He wants to do what he wants, so he will not observe social distancing. I mean, we saw that at Wembley, we saw that at the G7 summit, but he will force the rest of us to do it. And you've got a very them and us situation with this government, and that is very dangerous for a politician. That could come back to bite him, because he's now he's annoying his core base immensely. Because I speak to MPs who are getting emails from their constituents all the time saying, what's going on? This is not a Conservative government. This is a kind of socialist statist government. And it's all very well for Boris to do what he wants in number 10 and go to parties, which they all do, and not wear masks. But you cannot flaunt this as he does in photo opportunities and then, expect the British people to mask up.
Well, last question, Petronella. If another Prime Minister were in his place and Boris were still writing his columns, what do you think he'd be saying about the current restrictions and Freedom Day on the 19th of July?
He'd be saying that the current restrictions were appalling infringement of freedom. He'd be quoting Pericles of Athens. He'd be quoting Benjamin Franklin. He'd be pouring scorn on himself, as it were. If he was still the old Boris, because I think the old Boris has sort of disappeared. Power has done something to him. He would be hating himself as Prime Minister.
Petronella, thanks for joining us on Spectator TV.